Take a moment to look at a map of Africa. Really observe it. What do you notice about the way the continent is divided? Many of the borders, the lines that define nations, are unnaturally straight, cutting across landscapes and ignoring natural features. They appear rigid and imposed. It's as if these boundaries were drawn with a ruler, without regard for the people or the environment on the ground. These aren't the meandering lines of rivers or the crests of mountains. These lines, stark and unforgiving, were imposed by Europeans during the colonial era. They represent a period of intense external influence and control. These arbitrary borders often split communities, tearing apart families and kinship networks that had existed for generations. And just as damaging, they forced rival groups together within the same political boundaries, creating tensions and conflicts that continue to resonate today. These were groups with different languages, customs, and historical grievances. This redrawing of the map laid the groundwork for many of Africa's modern challenges, including political instability, ethnic conflicts, and economic disparities. The consequences of these decisions are still felt across the continent. Before colonization, before the arrival of these external forces, Africa was a vibrant mosaic of kingdoms, empires, and diverse societies, each with its own unique culture, governance, and traditions. These were complex and sophisticated civilizations. These societies had fluid identities and borders, often defined by natural geographic features, trade routes, or alliances adapting to changing circumstances over time. But to Europeans in the 1800s, driven by imperial ambitions and a desire for resources, Africa was often seen as a blank space on the map, a territory to be claimed and exploited, largely misunderstood and underestimated in its complexity and richness. The scramble for Africa was a frenzied race for resources and power, a period of intense competition among European nations. Rubber, essential for industrializing nations, gold, a symbol of wealth and power, diamonds, precious gems that fueled the luxury markets of Europe, all driven by insatiable European ambition and a desire for economic and political dominance. Borders were drawn in faraway European capitals, designed to serve the interests of distant empires, with little or no consideration for the local populations. These decisions were made with utter disregard for the people living there, their cultures, their histories, and their well-being. Imagine your family suddenly split by a line on a map, unable to visit each other freely, your connections severed by an arbitrary decision. Imagine your identity redefined overnight, forced to belong to a nation you didn't choose, your cultural heritage disrupted and marginalized. These artificial borders, imposed without consent or understanding, became deep scars on the continent, painful, lasting, and deeply real, continuing to shape the political, social, and economic landscape of Africa today. By the late 1800s, European powers were competing fiercely for Africa's riches. To avoid war among themselves, they met in Berlin in 1884, without a single African present. 14 European nations and the US divided the continent at the Berlin Conference, claiming to bring civilization, but really seeking land and power. The principle of effectivity required actual control to claim territory, sparking a mad dash to occupy land. Africans had no voice as their homelands were parceled out. The map of Africa became a chessboard for European ambitions. The fate of millions was decided in a room they weren't allowed to enter. With newfound power and a sense of entitlement, European powers began to redraw the map of Africa. They convened in Europe, far from the lands they sought to control, and with little understanding of the complex societies and cultures that thrived there. These European powers, driven by greed and a thirst for resources, carved up the continent with little knowledge or care for Africa's realities, its diverse ethnic groups, or its established political structures. The stroke of a pen in a European capital could determine the fate of millions. Ethnic groups like the Yu, who had lived and thrived in their territories for centuries, and the Somali people with their rich nomadic traditions, were arbitrarily split. Their lands divided between competing colonial powers, families were torn apart, and ancient trade routes were disrupted. Powerful kingdoms like Bakongo, with their own intricate systems of governance and diplomacy, were divided among rival empires, their sovereignty disregarded, and their people subjected to foreign rule. These lines, drawn on maps in European capitals, created artificial states bearing no resemblance to the existing social or political landscape. These arbitrary borders were not just lines on a map. They were instruments of forced integration, compelling diverse peoples, often with long histories of conflict, to coexist within the same colonial entity. This fracturing of established communities, the disruption of traditional social structures, and the imposition of foreign rule had devastating consequences for the people of Africa. Colonies were not established to foster nationhood or to improve the lives of the African people. They were built for extraction, for the sole purpose of enriching European powers. The Congo Free State, under the brutal rule of King Leopold II of Belgium, became the most brutal and horrifying example of this exploitation. It was King Leopold II's personal fiefdom, a vast territory treated as his private property, with no regard for the well-being of its inhabitants. In this personal colony, millions of Congolese people died under a regime of forced labor, terror, and unimaginable cruelty, all in the name of rubber production and personal enrichment. The horrors that occurred in the Congo Free State weren't isolated accidents or the result of rogue actors. They were the direct result of a system deliberately built for profit at any cost, a system that dehumanized and exploited the Congolese people for the benefit of a European monarch. Even after global outrage and international pressure finally forced Belgium to take over the Congo from Leopold II, the deep scars of exploitation, violence, and trauma remained, a lasting testament to the brutality of colonial rule. The legacy of these arbitrarily drawn borders that ignored the cultural, linguistic, and historical realities of the African people, and the deep wounds inflicted by colonial exploitation, are wounds that still haven't healed, continuing to shape the political and social landscape of Africa today. By 1900, nearly all of Africa was under European rule, except Ethiopia and Liberia. Traditional governance was dismantled, replaced by foreign systems designed for extraction. Africans were forced to grow cash crops and mine resources for Europe, leading to famine and dependency. Railways and infrastructure served colonial profits, not local needs. Artificial borders fueled future conflicts like Rwanda, Nigeria, and Congo by forcing rival groups together or splitting communities apart. Colonialism also attacked African identity, suppressing languages, religions, and traditions. European languages became official, creating a disconnected elite. The assault was on land and on culture, a legacy still felt today. The imposition of colonial rule was never met with passive acceptance. Africans, deeply rooted in their ancestral lands and cultures, recognized the inherent injustice and sought to resist the foreign domination that threatened their way of life. From the very beginning, resistance was constant, a simmering undercurrent that occasionally erupted into open rebellion. It took many forms, both subtle and overt, reflecting the diverse strategies employed by different communities across the continent. This resistance ranged from armed uprisings against colonial forces to more subtle forms of cultural defiance, aimed at preserving traditional values and identities in the face of relentless cultural assimilation. Africans understood that maintaining their cultural heritage was crucial to resisting the psychological and spiritual impact of colonialism. As the 20th century dawned, a powerful movement known as Pan-Africanism emerged, uniting people of African descent across the continent and throughout the diaspora. This movement sought to foster a sense of shared identity and destiny, demanding freedom, self-determination, and an end to colonial oppression. Visionary leaders like Webb Du Bois, a towering figure in the Pan-African movement, articulated the aspirations of a continent yearning for liberation. And Marcus Garvey, with his powerful call for black self-reliance and a return to Africa, ignited the imaginations of millions. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, and other charismatic figures emerged as beacons of hope, inspiring independence movements across the continent. Their unwavering commitment to freedom inspired independence movements after World War II, a period of profound global change and shifting power dynamics. By the 1960s, a wave of independence swept across Africa, and most colonies triumphantly became nations, raising their own flags and charting their own courses. However, these newly independent nations inherited the arbitrary borders and artificial divisions imposed by colonialism, a legacy that would continue to pose significant challenges. The daunting challenge now was to build unity, foster prosperity, and establish lasting stability in societies deeply scarred by decades of colonial rule. This was a monumental task, building a future from fractured foundations. Today, Africans are actively reclaiming their future, shaping their own destinies, and working towards a brighter tomorrow. They are diligently resolving conflicts through diplomacy and negotiation, integrating economies to foster trade and sustainable development, and proudly celebrating their diverse and vibrant cultures, reaffirming their unique identities on the world stage. Africa's story is not just one of scars and suffering, but a powerful testament to the indomitable spirit of its people, their resilience in the face of adversity, and their unwavering commitment to self-determination. The arbitrary lines drawn in Berlin so long ago do not and will not define Africa's future trajectory. Africans do, and they will continue to shape their own narrative, building a continent that reflects their aspirations, their values, and their enduring strength.